Perry Shelby drove the last nail into the seventh door frame on a cold October morning in 1878, stepped back into the pale New Mexico dust, and felt the strangest hollow feeling settle into his chest, not pride, not satisfaction, but the peculiar ache of a man who has built something too large for himself and cannot explain why he did it. The house sat on 40 acres of red-soiled land just east of the little railroad town of Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, where the Cimarron River bent south and the cottonwood trees grew thick enough to give a man shade in the summer and shelter from the north wind in the fall. Perry had bought the land 2 years prior with money saved from 6 years of cattle work on the great Goodnight-loving trail, money that had calloused his hands and weathered his face to something older than his 31 years. He had intended to build a modest place, 3 rooms, maybe 4, a bedroom, a kitchen, a sitting room where he could set his boots by the fire and read the newspapers that came in on the Santa Fe Railway. Something small and quiet, built for one. But somewhere between the laying of the foundation and the raising of the walls, his hammer had kept swinging. A room became 2, became 4, became 7, each one finished with the same careful attention Perry gave to everything. The floors planed smooth, the windows fitted with real glass ordered from a supplier in Kansas City, the walls plastered white and thick against the desert heat. He built a washroom with a deep basin. He built a room with shelves along every wall that he thought of, embarrassed, as a library though he owned fewer than a dozen books. He built 2 smaller rooms at the back of the house that were barely 8 feet square, close together, separated by a thin wall, and he told himself they were for storage even as he put proper doors on them and cut windows facing east so the morning light would come in soft and early. His nearest neighbor, an old rancher named Hector Fuentes, who ran longhorns on the land to the north, came by one afternoon in September and stood in the yard with his hat pushed back and looked at the house for a long while. "Who else is coming to live in that place, Shelby?" Hector asked. Perry had wiped the sawdust from his hands on his work trousers and looked at the house himself, as though seeing it freshly through the old man's eyes. 7 rooms, a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, a kitchen large enough to feed a crew. "Nobody," Perry said, "just me." Hector had made a sound low in his throat that was not quite a laugh, picked up his hat, and ridden back north without another word. Perry moved in on the 1st of October. He put his bedroll in the largest bedroom, set his 3 pots on the kitchen shelf, and arranged his few books in a row on the library shelves. The other 5 rooms stood empty. He walked through them in the evening sometimes, listening to the desert silence come through the glass windows, and he could not answer the question that kept rising in him, quiet and persistent as water finding its level. Why had he built so many rooms? The answer arrived on a Wednesday in late November, when the temperature had dropped sharp, and the first real cold of the season came riding down off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains on a cutting north wind. Perry was splitting firewood in the side yard when he heard the sound, not hoofbeats exactly, but the slower, uneven clomping of a horse that had been walked too far and too long. He set his axe in the chopping block and came around to the front of the house, and he saw them coming up the track from the road. A woman on horseback, sitting very straight in the saddle despite everything else that was clearly wrong with her situation. The horse beneath her was a bay gelding that had gone lame in the left foreleg and was limping badly, head bobbing with each step. Behind her, tied to the saddle horn by a length of rope, walked a mule that was loaded so heavily with bundles and packs and tied-down trunks that it looked less like an animal than a moving pile of luggage. And around the mule, spread out in a tired little procession, walked 6 children. Perry stood very still and counted them. He counted them twice. The oldest looked to be about 13 or 14, a lanky boy with dark hair falling into his eyes who was carrying a younger child on his back, a small girl, perhaps 3, who had her arms wrapped tight around his neck and her face pressed into his collar. Then there was another boy, maybe 10, walking with his head down and his hands shoved in his coat pockets. A girl who appeared about 8, holding the hand of a smaller boy, perhaps 5 or 6, who was stumbling with fatigue but not crying. And one more, a girl, the smallest on her own feet, who Perry guessed at 4 years old, trudging along with her eyes fixed on the ground with a concentration that was heartbreaking in someone so small. 6 children, 1 lame horse, 1 overloaded mule, and a woman who held herself like someone who had not stopped moving in days and intended not to stop until she had to. She looked up when she was 30 feet from him, and Perry saw her face for the first time. She was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark violet-brown eyes set wide in a face that was fine-boned and wind-chapped from hard travel, her dark hair pinned back under a gray traveling bonnet that had seen better seasons. There was a cut on her lower lip, not fresh, and the shadow of exhaustion under her eyes, but neither of those things were what held his attention. It was the steadiness in her expression, the absolute refusal to look defeated even though defeat was riding close behind her on that lame horse. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice was low and even, the voice of someone who had decided a long time ago that fear was not a useful emotion. "I can see you have a house. My horse has gone lame, and we have been walking since before dawn. I have 6 children who need to come inside somewhere warm, and I need to know if you are the kind of man who will allow that or the kind of man who will not." Perry Shelby had been a trail hand, a cow puncher, a fence builder, and a man who had once stood between a stampeding herd and a boy who had fallen from his horse. He was not a man who flustered easily, but something in those words, the blunt honesty of them, the complete absence of begging, the way she asked for help as though it were a straightforward business matter between 2 adults made him feel suddenly and acutely that everything that came before this moment in his life had been preamble. "Come inside," he said, "all of you." Her name was Violet Finley, and she told him so in the kitchen while he was building up the fire, and she was helping the smallest children out of their coats. Violet Finley, formerly of Abilene, Kansas, now of nowhere in particular, heading southwest toward the town of Taos where her late husband's brother had written to say he had land and could use a hand running it and had room for her and the children to stay while she got herself settled. "Was," Perry said, then caught himself. "You said your late husband. Thomas Finley," she said without flinching. "He died of typhoid fever in August, 4 months ago." She set a small coat on the chair back and looked at it for a moment. "We stayed in Abilene through September, through the end of the quarter on the house rental, and then the money ran out. I sold what I could and bought the horse and the mule and started west. Alone with 6 children. I am not alone," she said, and something in her voice was very precise about this. "I have 6 children." Perry noticed then that the oldest boy was standing in the kitchen doorway watching him with the careful, measuring look of a boy who had appointed himself the second man of the family and was taking the job seriously. Perry met the boy's eyes and gave him a small nod, one adult to another. The boy's jaw relaxed slightly. "That is Eli," Violet said, following Perry's look. "He is 14. Next to him at the table is Daniel, he is 10. The girls are Ruth, she is 8, and then James is 6, and me is 4, and the little one on Eli's back when you saw us was Clara. She is 3. Perry looked at all 6 of them arranged around his kitchen table, mittens coming off, noses red, hair tangled from the wind, their eyes moving around the warm room with the animal gratitude of creatures who had been cold and were now coming warm. He felt something shift in his chest, something structural, like a load-bearing wall finding its true purpose. "Are you hungry?" he asked. The question was answered by James, who was 6 and had not yet learned to hide his feelings, by nodding so hard that his whole small body participated in it. Perry made a meal that stretched everything. He had salt pork, cornbread from a pan of fresh mix, dried beans that he had to soak fast in hot water, and a pot of coffee for the adults and warm water with a little sugar for the children. He worked without thinking about it, stoking the fire, moving between the stove and the table, and it was only when he set the pan of cornbread down and looked up and saw Violet watching him from across the table that he realized he had never once cooked for anyone but himself in that kitchen, and that the kitchen had always felt, without his quite acknowledging it, too large for one. She was looking at him as though she was trying to solve something. "You live here alone," she said. "Yes." "This house is very large for one person." "I know it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said simply, "It is a good house." Something about the way she said it, not flattering him, not making conversation, just stating what she had assessed to be true, made Perry pick up the coffee pot to give his hand something to do. They slept that night in the two back rooms, the ones Perry had told himself were storage, the ones with the east-facing windows. Violet took the smaller one with Clara and me tucked in beside her on the floor on blankets Perry provided. Eli, Daniel, Ruth, and James took the other, and Perry heard the children's voices through the walls for a while, drowsy and then quieter, and then silent. And the silence of a house with people sleeping in it was so completely different from the silence of an empty house that he sat by the kitchen fire for a long while after, just listening to it. In the morning, Violet was up before him. He came into the kitchen at first light and found her at the stove, which she had stoked herself, making coffee in his pot with the efficiency of someone who had been keeping a household running on very little for a long time. She had already gone out to the barn, she told him without being asked, and checked the horse's hoof, which had a stone bruise that would need at least a week of rest before travel was advisable. "I cannot stay a week," she said. "I cannot impose on you." "You are not imposing," Perry said, and meant it with a directness that surprised even him. "The horse needs to rest. You and the children need to rest. There are rooms." She looked at him for a long moment over the rising steam of the coffee pot. "Why do you have 7 rooms?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. It was the most honest answer he had, and something in it seemed to satisfy her more than any fabricated reason would have. The week became 10 days, and 10 days became 2 weeks, and by the end of the second week, the horse was sound enough to travel, but a heavy December snow came down off the mountains and turned the road north of Cimarron into a mud slough that no sensible person would attempt with a loaded mule and 6 children. Perry suggested they wait until the road dried. Violet agreed, and he could see in her expression that she was grateful for the reason and grateful that he had offered it as a practical consideration rather than as charity. In those 2 weeks, Perry Shelby's house became, for the first time, the house it had always been shaped to be. Eli, who was 14 and had the serious disposition of someone much older, discovered that Perry kept a collection of tools in the barn and had a forge for minor metalwork, and he began appearing at Perry's elbow in the afternoons with questions about how things were made and fixed. Perry answered him, and then, because the boy had good hands and a sharp eye, he showed him things. And by the end of the first week, Eli could shoe a horse's left foreleg passably well, and had rewelded a cracked hinge on the barn door without supervision. Daniel, who was 10, was different, dreamier, slower to speak, but with a gift for observation that expressed itself in the drawings he made on whatever scraps of paper Violet could find for him. He drew the mountains as seen from the front porch, and the cottonwood trees with their bare December branches, and a very precise rendering of Perry's horse that was accurate enough to be recognizable. Perry found one of these drawings on the kitchen table one morning and stood looking at it for several minutes before setting it back down carefully, as though it were something valuable. Ruth, at 8, was her mother's daughter, practical, organized, and constantly engaged in some useful task. She helped Violet with the cooking, took charge of me and Clara with a cheerful authority that the smaller girls seemed to accept. And one afternoon Perry found her sitting at the kitchen table teaching James his letters with a stick of charcoal on a piece of brown paper. The two of them bent over the improvised lesson with the absolute seriousness of children who knew that schooling was important. James was 6 and conducted himself, in Perry's observation, as though the world were a series of interesting problems placed there specifically for his investigation. He asked questions continuously about the cattle Perry kept, about the way the river bent, about what the mountains were called and how far away they were, about whether horses could swim. Perry answered every question, partly because the boy's curiosity was genuine and appealing, and partly because answering James's questions turned out to be a reliable way to find himself standing near Violet, who usually smiled at her son's inquiries with an expression that was tired and loving in equal measure. Me at 4 was the shy one. She watched Perry from behind whatever piece of furniture was closest, peering around doorframes and chair backs with enormous dark eyes that were exactly Violet's eyes in miniature. She did not speak to him directly for the first 4 days. On the 5th day, she appeared beside him while he was reading by the fire in the evening and set a small object in his lap, a stone, smooth and brown, which she had apparently been carrying in her coat pocket. She looked at him with solemn gravity, then went back to her mother without a word. Perry kept the stone on the mantelpiece. Clara, who was 3, had no such reservations. She called him the big man with complete affection, and followed him around the house and yard with a persistence that reminded him, with unexpected tenderness, of a calf that had bonded to the wrong animal. She fell asleep in his barn one afternoon when he was doing feed rounds, curled in the straw near the bay gelding stall, and he carried her back to the house held against his shoulder, and felt the specific weight of a sleeping child for the first time in his life, small and absolute and trusting. Violet was sitting on the porch when he brought Clara back, wrapped in her coat, watching the sunset paint the Sangre de Cristo range in shades of copper and rose. She looked up when he came up the steps with the sleeping girl, and something moved across her face that was complicated and soft. "She adopted you," Violet said quietly, so as not to wake her. "Seems so," Perry said. He passed Clara carefully into Violet's arms, and their hands brushed in the transfer, just the ordinary accidental contact of 2 people exchanging a sleeping child, but neither of them moved away from it immediately. And Perry stood on the porch steps for a moment with the last light of December coming over the mountains and the child's warmth still on his shoulder, and thought, "There it is." He did not say anything. Neither did Violet. But the air between them had changed, and both of them knew it. 3 days later, Perry rode into Cimarron to collect his mail and supplies, and the postmaster, a thin-faced man named Alden Cooper who made it his business to know everyone else's business, looked at Perry over his spectacles and said, "Here you got a widow woman and a passel of children staying out at your place, Shelby." "That's correct," Perry said. "How many children?" "6. Alden Cooper's eyebrows went up. "6 children." "6, Perry confirmed, taking his mail and his change, and leaving before Alden could ask more questions he had no intention of answering. He stopped at the general store and bought more flour, more sugar, more salt pork, dried apples, and 2 pounds of hard candy, which he told himself were for the children and which definitely were. He also, without giving the matter too much deliberate thought, bought a book of illustrated natural history that he thought Daniel would like, a length of blue ribbon that he told himself was a practical household item, and a small pot of red paint that might be useful on the barn. Back at the house, he handed the illustrated book to Daniel, who opened it immediately and did not look up from it for the better part of an hour. He left the candy on the kitchen table, where the children found it with the controlled rapture of people who had been doing without luxuries for a long time. He hung the length of blue ribbon on a hook in the kitchen without explanation, and did not think about it again until he noticed, 2 days later, that Violet had tied it into her hair. The snow came back on the 15th of December, and it was a serious snow, the kind that shut everything down and made the road to Taos a thing that belonged to another season entirely. Perry looked out at it in the morning and felt a guilty relief that he kept carefully to himself, though he suspected, from the way Violet looked out at the snow and then back at the warm kitchen, that she was not entirely sorry either. He had begun to sit with her in the evenings after the children were asleep. It had started practically. Violet was a woman who was constitutionally unable to sit still without her hands occupied, and she had found in one of Perry's trunks a quantity of wool that he had bought at a fair 2 years earlier without any specific plan for it, and she had begun knitting. Perry had always been a reader in the evenings, and so he read, and the two of them sat by the kitchen fire together. And gradually, the way that things happening in the same space will start to happen in relation to each other, they began to talk. She told him about Thomas Finley, not bitterly, not sorrowfully, but honestly, the way you talk about something real that is over. Thomas had been a cattle buyer, a good man with a warm laugh and a talent for business that had kept them comfortable in Abilene. He had loved his children extravagantly and made them feel the world was large and full of possibility. When the typhoid came, it came fast, and by the time Violet understood what was happening, it was already close to the end. She had been left with 6 children and not enough money, and the particular injustice of that, of being left to do alone what had been built for 2, had made her not bitter but fiercely capable. She had decided she would not fail her children, and that had been the whole of her calculation. "How do you do it?" Perry asked her one evening. He meant it as a genuine question, with no idea it might sound like flattery. She was quiet for a moment, knitting needles moving. "I do not let myself think about how much there is to do," she said. "If you look at all of it at once, it is too large. You look at what is directly in front of you and you do that thing, and then you look at the next thing." Perry thought about this. "Is that how you ended up on the road to Taos?" "I ended up on the road to Taos because Thomas's brother Harvey has land and said he had room. It is the next thing." "Do you know Harvey Finley well?" Violet's knitting needles paused briefly. "I have met him twice. He seemed decent enough." "But you do not know if he truly has room." She did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer. Perry set his book down. "You are welcome to stay," he said, "as long as the road is closed. And after the road is open, if you need more time, you are welcome to stay longer." Violet looked at him directly, which she did when she was being precise. "You are being very kind." "I am being honest," he said. "There are 7 rooms in this house, and 2 of them are full of children who I have not minded having here. The kitchen was built too large for one person, and I have been aware of that fact since before you arrived." Something in Violet's expression moved, like light moving across still water. "Were you expecting someone?" she asked, and her voice was careful but not cold. "No," Perry said, "but I think I may have been building for someone without knowing it." The fire settled. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Violet looked back at her knitting, but the corners of her mouth had changed. On the morning of December 20th, Perry woke to the sound of voices in the kitchen and came out to find that Eli had already stoked the fire and was helping Violet make breakfast while Daniel sorted through the illustrated natural history book, pointing out a page to James with the proprietary enthusiasm of a child who has claimed a book and is sharing it as a favor. Ruth was braiding Me's hair with the blue ribbon. Clara was sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor conducting a conversation with Perry's cat, an orange Tom named Lincoln, who had previously lived in the barn and had, since the children arrived, renegotiated his housing arrangements to include the kitchen rug. Perry stood in the doorway and took in the scene, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the specific, uncomplicated warmth of a house that was being lived in. Violet looked up from the stove and caught him standing there. She did not say anything, but she tilted her head at the coffee pot in invitation, and he crossed the kitchen and poured himself a cup, and that was a quiet domestic thing, the kind of small, ordinary intimacy that builds into something large. Christmas came, which Perry had never paid much attention to since his own childhood, and it remade itself in his house into something he had not anticipated. Violet and the older children had, with very limited materials, managed to create a set of decorations, pine boughs from the trees that grew along the river bank, paper stars that Ruth had cut with precision from brown paper bags, a small wooden nativity that Violet unwrapped from tissue paper, in one of the trunks with the careful tenderness of something saved from a former life. Perry went to Cimarron on the 23rd and came back with a ham, a bag of oranges, a considerable expense and a real luxury, and presents for each child that he had thought about carefully. A proper pocket-knife for Eli, a set of colored chalks for Daniel, a new hair ribbon in green for Ruth, a toy wooden horse for James, a small rag doll for me, and a picture book with bright illustrations for Clara. He had also, without pausing to examine his own motivations too hard, bought a length of deep blue wool, the color of the sky over the mountains just after sunset, because he had thought of Violet's gray bonnet, which was a perfectly serviceable bonnet that belonged to a woman who deserved something better. He gave her the wool on Christmas morning, wrapped in a piece of brown paper, and she unwrapped it with the children around her, all of them vibrating with the particular energy of Christmas, and she held the fabric up and looked at him, and for a moment she forgot to maintain the careful practical composure she usually wore. "Perry," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and it did something to the air in the room. "For a new bonnet," he said. "The gray one has given its service." She folded the fabric carefully and held it against her chest for a moment, and when she looked up her eyes were bright. "Thank you," she said, and those two words from Violet Finley, who did not waste words, landed with a weight that Perry felt in his sternum. After Christmas, the weather broke briefly, and the roads were passable for a few days, and Perry knew that Violet would have to make a decision. He had not asked her to stay permanently. He had no right to ask that, he told himself, and had argued himself out of it several times, but he was aware, with a clarity that had been building for weeks, that the idea of this house returning to silence was something he could not contemplate without a dull, spreading sense of wrongness. He was in the barn, rechecking the bay gelding's hoof, which had healed cleanly, when he heard Violet's boots on the barn floor. He straightened, and she came to stand near the horse's head, stroking his nose with the absent, automatic gesture of someone who has been around horses long enough that it requires no thought. "The road is clear," she said. "It is," Perry said. "I should move on to Harvey's." Perry was quiet for a moment. He looked at the horse and then at Violet, and then he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I have been trying for 3 weeks to determine whether what I am feeling is the result of loneliness and the general pleasure of company or whether it is specific," he said, "and I have concluded that it is specific." Violet was very still. "I know that you are 4 months a widow," he continued, his voice steady. "I know that you have 6 children and a road to Taos, and a plan that was made before you came here. I know that I have no claim on you and am not asking for one. I'm only telling you because I believe in being direct about true things, that this house has been the right size since the day you arrived, and if you left it with all 6 of your children, I would feel the lack of each one of you in every one of the 7 rooms." Violet looked at him for a long time. The horse made a small sound and tossed his head, and she steadied him without looking away from Perry. "You are a very direct man," she said. "I was a trail hand for 6 years," he said. "You learn to say things clearly when you have to. Thomas has been gone 4 months, she said slowly. "I will not pretend I do not, that I have not noticed you, Perry. But I will not be taken care of out of pity, and I will not let my children be disrupted again for something that might not last. I would not ask you to accept pity," he said. "I do not offer it, and I have never built anything that did not last." He said it simply, without performance, and she heard in it what was true. A man who measured twice before he cut, who planed floors smooth because a thing worth building was worth building well, who had put real glass in 7 sets of windows for a reason he could not name until she walked up his road. Violet looked away, out the open barn door at the winter fields and the mountains beyond. She was quiet for a long time. Perry did not rush her. "I will write to Harvey," she said at last, "and tell him I have found a situation." Something in Perry's chest unlocked with a sensation so physical he almost put his hand over it. He did not. He just nodded steadily the way he did most things. "We will take it slowly," she said. "The children have to come first." "Of course," he said, and he meant it. Winter moved through January at its own slow pace, and Perry and Violet moved around each other with a careful, growing attentiveness that had in it all the pleasure of something that is being done at the right speed. There was no rush. There did not need to be. The house was warm and the children were settling, and every day brought some new evidence of the way this arrangement was becoming something rooted. Eli had taken on the role of Perry's barn hand with a seriousness that went beyond adolescent helpfulness. He was learning to read horses, to handle cattle, to mend fence with the efficiency of someone who understood that every hour of work done well was an hour of security for his family. Perry paid him a small wage for the first time in February, handing him 3 silver coins and watching the boy's jaw tighten with a kind of pride that was moving to witness. "You do not have to do that," Eli said. "You earned it," Perry said. "A man who works earns a wage. That is not charity." Eli looked at the coins for a moment, then put them carefully in his vest pocket. "My father always said something like that," he said, and his voice was even but his throat moved. "He sounds like he was a good man," Perry said. "He was the best man I knew," Eli said. He looked at Perry directly, with the full measuring gravity he brought to everything. "Before now," he added quietly, and walked away to the hay loft, leaving Perry standing in the barn with something in his eyes that had nothing to do with the winter dust. Daniel filled the library room with drawings. Perry bought him a proper set of drawing pencils from Cimarron and Daniel, installed himself at the small desk in the library, and covered the desk surface with papers, and produced drawings of such quality and observation that even the natural reserve of a 31-year-old former trail hand could not prevent Perry from looking over the boy's shoulder regularly and commenting on what he saw. "This one is you," Daniel said one afternoon, turning a paper toward Perry without ceremony. It was a pencil drawing of a man at the woodpile, axe raised, seen from the angle of someone watching from the kitchen window. The figure had Perry's broad shoulders and the particular way he stood when he was working hard, weight forward, absorbed. "When did you draw this?" Perry asked. "Last week," Daniel said. "May I have it?" Daniel considered. "Yes," he said, "but you have to say which one is your favorite and I will keep that one myself." Perry looked through the accumulated drawings on the desk: mountain views, the river in different lights, Lincoln the cat in various positions of comfort, the children themselves, a very good rendering of Violet's hands while she was knitting. He picked up the one of Violet's hands. "This one," he said. Daniel studied him for a moment with his quiet, perceptive eyes. "I thought you might say that one," he said, and took it back with careful satisfaction. February brought a town matter that could not be ignored. There was a gathering at the Cimarron Community Hall, one of the regular meetings that served as both social and practical occasion in a small frontier town, where everything from road maintenance to land disputes to the arrival of the railroad schedule was discussed over coffee and pie. Perry had attended these meetings regularly and was generally respected. He had purchased his land fairly, paid his debts, and was known to be a straight dealer. He took Violet with him. It was the first time they had appeared in town together, and Perry was not naive about what that meant or how it would be received. He was also not a man who altered his behavior to suit other people's comfort, and so he helped Violet down from the wagon with ordinary courtesy and walked beside her into the hall and introduced her to the people who came forward, which was most of the room. The Cimarron community in 1878 and 1879 was a mix of Anglo settlers, Mexican families with deep territorial roots, a few remaining Ute and Apache men who worked the surrounding ranches, and the varied assortment of people that the Santa Fe Railway had drawn west. Hector Fuentes came over immediately and shook Violet's hand with genuine warmth, and his wife Maria, who was a broad, decisive woman of 60 who had raised 6 children of her own on the range, took Violet by the arm and introduced her to 3 other women before Perry had finished hanging his coat. There were other looks, more measured ones, the kind that came from people who were calculating the impropriety of a widow woman living in an unmarried man's house. Perry had expected this and had decided his response to it in advance, which was to behave as though the calculation were not being made, because its conclusion was nobody's business but his and Violet's. One man, a land speculator named Whitaker who had moved in from Colorado the previous spring and had been attempting to buy up adjoining parcels for the last year, approached Perry during the coffee portion of the evening with a look that attempted to be both friendly and pointed. "Here you have got yourself a house guest, Shelby," Whitaker said. "Several," Perry said. "Mrs. Finley and her children are staying at my place." "Indefinitely." "That is between Mrs. Finley and myself," Perry said. Whitaker smiled in a way that did not involve his eyes. "Folks talk," he said. "Folks are welcome to," Perry said, and moved away to stand beside Violet, which was where he preferred to be. On the wagon ride home, with the children asleep in the wagon bed and the winter stars very clear and cold above the road, Violet sat beside Perry on the bench and said, "That man Whitaker, he does not like you. He has been trying to buy the eastern corner of my land for the past year," Perry said. "I have said no 3 times. Why does he want it? Because the railroad is planning a new spur line, and if he can secure that corner, he controls the closest access point. There is money in it." "Are you going to keep saying no?" "Yes," Perry said. Violet was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Good." He glanced at her sideways. "It is good land," she said simply. "A person should not sell good land to someone who only sees money in it." Perry looked back at the road, and he was smiling. There was a night in the 3rd week of February when the temperature dropped to something serious, the kind of cold that got into bones and stayed, and Perry brought all the extra quilts out of the storage room and took them to the back rooms. And when he knocked on Violet's door, she opened it and was awake, sitting with Clara and me on either side of her under the existing blankets, all 3 of them reading, Violet reading aloud from one of the books, the children listening with their eyes half closed. He handed in the quilts. Violet took them and said, "Thank you, come in for a moment." He came in and sat on the low stool near the door because there was not much other space, and Violet settled Clara and me under the new warmth of the extra quilt and continued reading, aloud for a little while, and Perry sat on the stool and listened and watched her. The way she read expressively, giving the characters different voices, the way she pushed me's hair back without interrupting the story, the way her own face changed with the narrative as though she were hearing it for the first time. Clara fell back asleep within minutes. Me lasted a little longer, but her eyes were closed before the end of the page. Violet closed the book and looked up at Perry. "You are very good at that," he said quietly so as not to wake the girls. "I have had practice," she said. Then after a pause, "Do you want children of your own someday?" The question was direct, the way her questions always were, but under the directness was something more careful and searching. "I wanted a family," Perry said, equally direct. "I always have. I am 31 years old and I have spent the last decade building what I thought I needed to build before I could invite one in. The house was the last piece." Violet looked at him steadily. "And then I arrived with 6. Yes." She looked down at me, who was sleeping with her small fist curled under her chin. "They already like you very much," she said. "Even Eli, who does not let himself like things easily." "I know," Perry said. "I like them very much, each one. Clara calls you the big man." "I know that too." Violet smiled, really smiled, not the polite small smile she used in town, but the full one, the one that made her eyes warm. "She called Thomas Papa Man until she was almost 2, she said. There was grief in it, but also love, and the combination was not uncomfortable. She has a talent for naming." Perry thought about this. "What would you call me?" he asked. He kept his voice easy, as though the question were light, but they both knew it was not. Violet looked at him for a long moment in the small lamplight, with her daughters sleeping beside her and the cold pressed against the windows outside and the warm house holding all of them. "I would call you the right kind of man," she said, "if I called you anything." Perry stood up from the stool quietly. "Get some sleep," he said. "The temperature is going down tonight." "Perry," she said before he reached the door. He turned. I am very glad my horse went lame in front of your house and not someone else's. He was glad of it, too. He was more glad of it than he had words for, standing in the doorway with the lamplight behind her and the cold pressing at the glass. He said, "Good night, Violet," and went back down the hall to his own room, and lay awake for a while listening to the house settle in the cold, feeling very much a man who was where he was supposed to be. March came in fierce, with the last push of winter in it, and then began to loosen its grip in the second week. The road to Taos was clear and passable. Harvey Finley's letter had arrived 2 weeks earlier, a brief, not entirely warm note acknowledging Violet's letter, and saying that the room he had mentioned was in fact a single room in the bunkhouse and that 6 children had not been what he had envisioned when he made the offer. It was not unkind, but it was honest, and it made Taos no longer a destination. Perry read the letter with Violet at the kitchen table. She showed it to him herself, without comment. He read it and set it down. "That was not much of an offer," he said. "No," she agreed. "It was not." She folded the letter. "I have been thinking." "About what?" "About staying." She said it carefully, looking at the table. I am not asking you to make any promises. I am not asking anything. I am thinking about it from the children's point of view. They are settled here. Eli has real work he is good at. Daniel has his drawings and his book. Ruth is teaching the little ones their letters. The children are happy, Perry. I have not seen them this settled since before Thomas got sick." "And from your own point of view?" he asked. She looked up at him. "From my own point of view," she said, and paused, and then said, with the particular courage of a woman who has been through enough, that fear of honest feeling is a luxury she does not bother with. "I do not want to leave." Perry reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She did not pull back. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a moment, hands joined on the kitchen table in the morning light, and it was a simple and complete thing. "Then do not leave," he said. Spring arrived in Cimarron in the way it always did, tentatively at first, then with a rush. The cottonwoods exploding into green along the river, the red soil softening, the mountains going from white to brown to the deep green of the higher forests. Perry's cattle came through the winter well, and the spring roundup took him and Eli away from the house for 3 days, working with the neighboring ranchers to sort and count and brand the new calves. It was during this roundup that Perry had a long conversation with Hector Fuentes while they were mending a stretch of fence on the boundary line. Hector was 62 and had been married to Maria for 40 years, and was one of the straightest dealing men Perry had ever known. And Perry found himself talking about Violet with the kind of openness that the combined effects of hard outdoor work and the presence of a man you genuinely respect can produce. "She is not one of these women who needs to be managed," Hector said, in the way that people who have lived long enough to see many kinds of marriages summarize their observations. "No," Perry agreed. "She does not need anything from me except respect and honesty. She is perfectly capable of managing her own life." "Then she has chosen to stay with you because she wants to, not because she has to," Hector said. "That is the best reason." He drove a staple into the fence post with a single practiced blow. "Marry her, Shelby. Do not wait until you have convinced yourself it makes logical sense and is practically optimal. It already is those things. But more than that, you love her and she knows it, and your house has been the right size for all of them since November, and if you cannot see that, you are a fool, and I know for a fact you are not a fool." Perry was quiet for a moment. "She has been a widow for 6 months," he said. "She has also been alone on the road with 6 children, and she has been through enough to age a calendar quickly," Hector said. "Ask her. Let her decide." Perry drove his own staple and said nothing else, but Hector caught the look on his face and gave a small, satisfied nod and let the subject rest. 3 days later, on a Sunday evening in late March, with the last light of the day coming through the kitchen window, and the children either in the yard or in the back rooms, Perry found Violet on the front porch, sitting in the chair she had claimed early on, watching the sunset spread copper and orange over the western range. He sat down in the chair beside her, which he always did, and they watched the colors for a while, and then Perry said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, nothing changes between us unless you want it to." Violet turned to look at him. She had done something with her hair that evening, pinned it differently, and in the warm evening light she was simply and entirely beautiful. "I would like you to marry me," Perry said. "I am asking you clearly, and I am asking you for all the reasons that are true, because I love you, and because I love your children, and because this house was built for all of you and has been waiting for all of you for longer than I knew." Violet looked at him for a long moment. There were things moving in her face, the grief for Thomas, which was real and deserved its space, and something new, something that had been building for months in this house, in this kitchen, in the evenings by the fire and the mornings over coffee, and the particular way Perry had answered James's 1,000 questions and carried Clara back from the barn and put a smooth stone on the mantelpiece. "You love them," she said. "You truly love them." "Every one of them," he said. Eli with his two serious eyes and his careful hands. Daniel who sees everything and says it in drawings. Ruth who teaches her brothers their letters without anyone asking. James who wants to know how the world works. Me who gave me a stone. Clara who calls me the big man. His voice was steady, but there was no concealing what was in it. "They are extraordinary people, Violet, all six. I do not know how a man could not love them." Violet put her hand over her mouth for a moment, and he could see that she was keeping herself steady with effort. Then she took her hand away and looked at him with clear eyes. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Perry, I will marry you." He reached out and took her hand, and they sat on the porch together while the sunset finished its business over the mountains, and the voices of the children drifted from the yard, and the house behind them held its warmth in all 7 rooms. They told the children at supper. Perry had thought about how to do this with some care, because 6 children ranged in age from 3 to 14, represented 6 different ways of receiving the news that their mother was going to remarry. He had no intention of replacing Thomas Finley. He did not have the arrogance to attempt it, but he intended to be fully present, fully responsible, and fully invested in each of these 6 people for the rest of his life. Violet sat at the head of the table, and Perry sat across from her, and they told the children together, Violet speaking first and then Perry adding his own part of it, which was addressed directly to the older ones who were old enough to weigh it. "I am not your father," Perry said to Eli, Daniel, and Ruth, while me and James listened and Clara looked between the adults with her general expression of benevolent puzzlement. "Your father was Thomas Finley, and he was a good man, and he will always be your father. I am asking your mother to let me be her husband, and to let me be family to all of you in whatever way feels right to each of you. You do not owe me anything for that. It is what I want." There was a moment of silence. Eli looked at his mother, then at Perry with that careful 14-year-old gravity. "You will take care of her," he said. It was not quite a question. "I will," Perry said. Eli looked down at the table, then back up. He nodded once firmly. Daniel said nothing, but his pencil appeared in his hand with the automatic reflex of someone who processes things by drawing, and he was quiet for the rest of supper in the way that meant he was working through something important internally. Ruth said, practically, "Will we stay in these rooms? Or we can arrange the rooms differently if you prefer," Perry said. "There are 7. We can make them whatever you need them to be." Ruth seemed to find this satisfactory. James said, "Does that mean you are ours?" "Yes," Perry said. "That means I am yours." James looked pleased and turned back to his supper with the energy of someone who has confirmed a useful fact. Me said nothing, but she left her seat, came around the table, and climbed into Perry's lap without ceremony and settled there. Perry put his arm around her and looked at Violet over the top of me's head, and Violet's eyes were bright. Clara said, "Big man is staying." "The big man is staying," Violet said. Clara nodded as though this were a satisfactory resolution to a question she had always considered settled, and went back to her cornbread. They were married on the 2nd Saturday of April in 1879, at the community hall in Cimarron, before a circuit judge who came through on the Santa Fe Railway every third week. Maria Fuentes had taken charge of the wedding preparations with an authority that brooked no argument and a generosity that extended to providing flowers from her greenhouse, a cake that she had apparently been planning for 2 weeks, and a dress for Violet that was her own daughter's, altered to fit, in a deep blue that was so close to the color of the wool Perry had given her for Christmas that, when Violet put it on and came out into the kitchen on the morning of the wedding, Perry had to look at the wall for a moment to get his thoughts in order. Eli walked Violet down the aisle of the community hall. He was 14 and very tall for it, and he walked beside his mother with a dignity and a grief and a love that made every person in the room feel the weight of what was happening and the rightness of it simultaneously. Perry stood at the front and watched them come, Violet in the deep blue dress with her dark hair pinned, and a single flower that Ruth had put there, and Eli in his best clothes walking her forward with the gravity of someone who is completing one of the most important duties of his life. Perry put his hand out, and Eli placed Violet's hand in it. The two of them looked at each other, Perry and this 14-year-old boy who was the man of the Finley family, until he chose to transfer that custody, and something passed between them that required no words. Eli stepped back to stand with his siblings in the front row. The ceremony was brief, and the judge read the words and Perry and Violet said the words, and it was done not because what was simple was cheap, but because what was true did not need elaboration. Perry put a ring on Violet's finger, a thin gold band he had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe, which had arrived 2 days before the wedding, wrapped in paper and fitting perfectly. Violet looked at it on her hand for a moment with an expression that would have broken any watching heart, and then she looked up at Perry and smiled. He kissed her, which was appropriate to the occasion, and Daniel, from the front row, let out a long breath that had clearly been held for some time, and the hall erupted in the genuine warmth of a community that had been watching these two people find each other since November, and was pleased to see the matter properly concluded. The spring and summer of 1879 in Cimarron were among the finest Perry Shelby could remember or imagine. The house was fully alive in every room. Perry moved his cattle operation to include a small dairy component that provided milk and butter, partly for the household and partly to sell, which was Violet's idea, and which turned out to be a solid income addition. Eli, who had discovered he had a genuine gift for working with animals, became the primary hand for both operations and was developing the skills and the judgment of a rancher twice his age. Perry spoke to him man-to-man about the land, about how it worked, about what it required, with the intention that Eli would know this place the way a man knows something he has been trusted with. Daniel filled the library room walls with his drawings. Perry had stopped resisting this and now actively encouraged it, buying him more pencils and paper, and once a beautiful bound sketchbook from Kansas City, and his talent was becoming something that people in Cimarron noticed. Maria Fuentes commissioned a portrait of her husband for his birthday, and Daniel produced it with such skilled observation that Hector spent 10 minutes looking at it with wet eyes. Ruth was 9 by midsummer and had taken on, entirely by her own initiative, the project of teaching the younger children properly. She had written to the territorial office in Santa Fe requesting a curriculum, and had received a packet of materials by mail, which she spread on the kitchen table with the satisfied air of someone who has secured a useful resource and intended to deploy it effectively. She taught James and me their letters and numbers with a patience and persistence that Violet watched, sometimes from the doorway with an expression of pure wonder. James was 7 and still asking questions at a rate that suggested he would eventually know everything there was to know about New Mexico Territory, the Rocky Mountains, the cattle industry, the Santa Fe Railway, the Spanish land grants, the history of the Apache people who had occupied these lands for centuries before the territory, the behavior of horses in cold weather, and the growing habits of cottonwood trees. Perry answered all of them and did not once find the questions tedious. Me, at 5, was still quiet, but the shyness had changed into something more like selectivity. She chose carefully what to say and to whom, and when she spoke it was always precise and often unexpectedly perceptive. She had made a collection of stones on the windowsill of her room. The original one she had given Perry was still on the mantelpiece, and that pleased her, and she could describe each stone's provenance and particular color with the focused attention of someone who finds the world full of things worth noticing. Clara, at 3 going on 4, had abandoned the name Big Man in favor of Papa Perry, which she had arrived at by herself and announced one morning at breakfast, as though it were a decision she had made during the night, and which she expected everyone to accept, which they did, because Clara's announcements tended to have that quality. Perry heard it for the first time and had to excuse himself from the breakfast table for a moment, and he stood on the front porch in the June morning air and looked at the mountains for a while until he was sufficiently composed to go back inside. In July, Violet told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning before the children were up. She stood with her coffee cup in both hands and watched his face, and Perry's face did what it almost never did in public: it showed everything. "Are you well?" he managed. "I am perfectly well," she said, with the composed certainty of a woman who had been through this 6 times and knew what well felt like in comparison to other things. Perry crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her, coffee cup and all, and held her for a long moment. She rested her forehead against his shoulder, and he felt her exhale, the particular exhale of someone who has been carrying a thing carefully and has now for a moment been able to set it down. "7 children," he said into her hair. "Not yet," she said. "Eventually." She laughed, soft and warm against his shoulder. "Eventually." The summer continued in its golden way, full and busy and good. Cimarron in 1879 was a town that was finding its permanent shape. The railway had brought commerce. The land had filled with people building lives of varying intentions and character, and the old injustices of the territory, the displacement of the Ute and Apache peoples, the complicated politics of the old Spanish land grant system, the ways that Anglo settlement had overwritten lives and histories that had been here for generations, were things that Perry and Violet talked about honestly in the evenings by the fire, because they believed in seeing what was true even when it was uncomfortable. Their neighbor on the southern side was a Ute man named Running Elk, who had worked as a tracker and guide for the Army before the Army had decided his services were no longer required. He now ran a small horse ranch and was one of the finest horsemen Perry had ever seen. They had been on good terms since Perry bought his land, and in the spring of 1879, that good neighbor relationship had deepened when Running Elk's fence came down in a storm, and Perry and Eli had helped rebuild it without being asked and without expecting anything in return. Running Elk had come to the wedding in April and sat in the back of the hall with the dignified reserve of a man who had learned to read the temperature of any Anglo gathering carefully. Afterward, he had come to Perry and shaken his hand and then bowed slightly to Violet, which she returned, and he had given the children a gift, a carved wooden horse for each child, made from different woods, each one slightly different, with the individual attention of someone who made things with care. The children had received these with the kind of speechless reverence that is the truest form of gratitude. In August, Running Elk came by the house with a proposition. He had a line on 12 good horses, Comanche stock, well-bred, that he could acquire at fair price, but he needed a partner for the venture because the capital required was more than he had on hand. He and Perry sat on the front porch and discussed it while Violet brought coffee, and by the end of the evening they had a deal and a partnership that would prove over the following years to be one of the soundest business arrangements Perry ever made. Violet had sat in on the conversation, which Running Elk had accepted without comment, and when Perry looked at her at one point for her opinion, she gave it directly, and Running Elk had listened and nodded and incorporated her observation into the terms of the discussion. Afterward, she told Perry that she liked him, which was not a judgment Violet made lightly or often. September came in warm and the land was golden, the cottonwoods going to yellow and the mountains drawing sharp and clear against the blue sky. Violet's pregnancy was showing now, and she went about her days with the same unflinching practicality she brought to everything, making adjustments where needed and refusing to make an invalid of herself. On an afternoon in mid-September, Perry came in from the south pasture and found Daniel in the library, sitting at his desk, working on a drawing with unusual concentration. Daniel looked up when Perry came in and hesitated, which was unusual for him. "I drew something," he said. "I want you to have it." He turned the paper around. It was a drawing of the house, Perry's house, their house seen from the road, from the angle of someone approaching on foot. The 7 windows visible from the front face were all lit from within, each one showing something different: a figure reading, children at a table, a lamp movement. The house itself was rendered with precise architectural affection, every plank and shutter and porch board in place. And in the foreground, on the road leading up to the house, there was a woman on a horse and 6 small figures walking beside her, drawn from the back as though mid-approach. "This is us arriving," Daniel said. "In November." Perry could not speak for a moment. He looked at the drawing and then at Daniel, this 10-year-old boy who saw everything and said it in pencil lines. "Thank you," Perry said. It came out roughly. "It is the most important drawing I have ever made," Daniel said, with the absolute certainty of someone who has thought about it and is sure. "Because everything good started there." Perry put the drawing in a frame, the best frame he could find in Cimarron, which was not extravagant but was solid and well-made, and hung it in the kitchen where he could see it every morning. October passed, and November arrived, and it had been exactly 1 year since Violet and her 6 children had come up the road with the lame horse. Perry noticed the date and did not make a formal occasion of it, but in the evening, when the children were settled and the house was quiet, he poured 2 glasses from a bottle of good whiskey he had been keeping, and brought one to Violet where she sat by the fire. She took the glass and looked at him. "You remembered," she said. "November 15th, he said. She touched her glass to his. "1 year ago I was praying my horse would not go completely lame before I found somewhere warm for the children. And instead you found a house with 7 rooms, and a man who had built them for reasons he could not explain." Perry sat down beside her. "I can explain them now," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had done for the first time in September and which Perry had decided was among his favorite things in the world. "Tell me," she said. "I built them for you," he said. "Each room, the kitchen for a family that needed a big table, the library for a boy who draws and a woman who reads aloud, the 2 back rooms for children who needed to feel safe, the bedroom for us, the washroom with the deep basin because 6 children need a lot of washing, and the sitting room because a family needs a place to be together and not be doing anything in particular, just being." Violet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And the 7th room." "For whoever is coming next," he said, and put his hand on her rounded belly, and felt the small determined movement that meant someone was already on their way. The baby came in late January of 1880, a boy, born healthy and loudly opinionated about the cold, with Violet's dark eyes and Perry's broad shoulders already visible in the sturdy set of his infant form. Perry was there for every moment of it, which was not always the way of frontier men, but was the only way Perry was capable of approaching anything that mattered. And when the baby was placed in his arms for the first time, he stood with him by the bedroom window in the early morning light, and looked out at the mountains, and felt the whole of his life arranged perfectly around him, like rooms of a house, each furnished exactly right. They named him Thomas Perry Shelby, Thomas, for the man who had loved Violet first and would always be part of their family's story, Perry for the man who would love her now and for everything ahead. It was Violet's idea, and Perry had felt, when she proposed it, that it was exactly the right and generous thing. The kind of naming that makes room for all the love there is without asking any of it to diminish. Eli, who was 15 by then and had grown another 2 inches, and was beginning to look very much like the man he was going to be, held the baby with the careful competence of someone who had been holding babies since he was 8 years old, and looked down at his small brother with an expression that was completely unguarded, for once openly loving, openly happy. "Welcome, Tom," he said quietly, using the short name, and the baby, with the fundamental reasonableness of the Finley children, seemed to find this acceptable. Daniel drew the baby within his first week of life and produced a portrait of such tenderness that Violet framed it and put it in the bedroom. Ruth organized the household's adaptation to the new arrival with the efficiency of a young woman who would clearly go on to run whatever she chose to run with considerable success. James was fascinated by the baby's mechanical operations and asked questions about infant physiology that neither Perry nor Violet could fully answer. Me touched the baby's hand with one careful finger and then looked up at Perry with luminous eyes. "He has my nose," she said. "He does," Perry agreed. Clara, at 4, took one look at the baby and announced that he was hers and that she would take care of him. She proceeded to do this with a supervision that was occasionally aggressive but genuinely motivated by love. And Thomas Perry Shelby grew up understanding from his earliest days that Clara was a force of nature who would always be in his corner. Spring came again, and the horse partnership with Running Elk was thriving. The Comanche stock horses they had brought in over the previous year were selling well, and Running Elk's skill in training them and Perry's network of buyers along the cattle trails made for a combination that worked cleanly and profitably. They hired 2 additional hands that spring, young men who worked honestly and learned fast under Eli's increasingly authoritative direction. Whitaker, the land speculator, had made one more approach to Perry about the eastern corner, this time with a written offer and a lawyer from Albuquerque. Perry and Violet sat with the lawyer at the kitchen table, with coffee and a pleasant composure that clearly unnerved the lawyer somewhat, and Perry declined the offer clearly and permanently, and Whitaker eventually sold his own holdings and moved on to other territories where the land was less obstinate. The summer of 1880 was the fullest and happiest that Perry could imagine measuring. The 7 rooms of the house were all occupied in various ways at various times. The library belonged to Daniel and was also a schoolroom when Ruth assembled her students, which still included regular lessons for James and me, and now an early introduction to the alphabet for Clara, who attended on her own terms and walked out whenever she had reached her capacity for formal learning. The sitting room was where the family gathered in the evenings, crowded and warm and always loud in a way that Perry had once thought he might not like, but had discovered he loved with a fierceness that surprised him. He sat on the front porch on a Sunday evening in July, with the mountains going gold in the late light and Thomas on his knee, the baby now 6 months old and very interested in the world, reaching for Perry's shirt buttons with determined small fists. Violet came out and sat beside him, and from inside came the sound of the family, Daniel arguing cheerfully with James about something from the natural history book, Ruth's voice teaching, Clara loudly supervising something, me's quieter voice reading aloud to herself. "Do you hear that?" Violet said. "Yes," Perry said. She leaned against him, and he shifted Thomas to his other knee to put his arm around her, and the 3 of them sat on the porch together with the mountains in front of them and the house behind them and the whole full weight of an improbably perfect life arranged around them. "I keep thinking," Violet said, "about the road, about being on the road and not knowing where it was going." "And now," he said, "now I know exactly where it went," she said. "It went here." The months that followed were marked by the ordinary, extraordinary events of a life being lived fully. Eli turned 16 in the fall, and Perry sat him down and had a formal conversation about the future of the land, what Perry was building, what he intended, and that he would not require Eli to be a rancher if ranching was not what called him, but that if it was, there was a future here that was genuinely his. Eli had listened with the full attention he brought to important things, and then he had said quietly that he wanted to stay, that this was his home. That Perry had made it his home, and he did not take that lightly, and he would not waste it. Perry had put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and they had both gone back to work. Daniel, at 12, had written a letter entirely on his own initiative to the territorial newspaper in Santa Fe, enclosing some drawings, and had received a reply expressing interest in publishing them. He had brought the reply to Perry with an expression that was trying very hard not to be as excited as it was, and Perry had read the letter and said, "That is a fine thing, Daniel," and the boy had let himself be properly excited after that. His drawings appeared in the newspaper twice before the year was out, with his name below them. The Christmas of 1880 was different from the Christmas of 1878 in ways that could not be enumerated but could be felt in every room of the house. There was a tree, a real pine brought down from the higher slopes by Perry and Eli on horseback, which they had strapped to the mule's pack with some difficulty, and which had been received by the children with a level of enthusiasm that justified the effort. There were decorations that had accumulated over the year, Ruth's paper stars augmented by new ones, pine boughs, the wooden nativity from Violet's trunk, and Clara's recent addition of a series of rocks painted red and arranged at the nativity scene's base to represent, she explained, the animals who had not made it into the Bible's account. Perry gave Violet a brooch on Christmas morning, a small silver piece with a violet pressed under glass, which he had commissioned from a silversmith in Santa Fe. He had given the silversmith the specific instructions of what he wanted, which were modest, and the silversmith had made something better than what Perry had described, which was how good craftsmen worked. And when Violet opened the small box and saw it, she pressed her fingers over her mouth and then looked at Perry with eyes that said everything. She pinned it to her collar and wore it all day, and Perry caught himself looking at it several times with the private satisfaction of a man who has given the right thing to the right person. Thomas, at 11 months, managed to pull himself upright against the leg of the kitchen table on Christmas morning, balanced there for 3 trembling seconds of absolute concentrated effort, and then sat down with a thump. The cheer that went up from 6 older siblings and 2 parents was enough to wake the cat, who was asleep on the kitchen rug. Into the new year of 1881, Cimarron continued to grow and change, as all the frontier towns did in those years of rapid settlement. The Santa Fe Railway brought new people, new commerce, new complications. Perry watched the changes with the measured attention of someone who had chosen to put down roots and therefore had a stake in what grew around them. He became more involved in the community, not because he sought authority, but because he had the respect of the people around him and the ability to speak plainly in the meetings where plainness was needed. And Violet was a presence beside him in those gatherings whose quality of attention and whose directness of speech had, over the 2 years of their marriage, become something the community relied on. The spring of 1881 brought another piece of news Violet was expecting again, and this time she told him outside, on the porch, in the early morning when the air was still cool and the light was coming up gold over the mountains. And Perry turned to her and put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her forehead first and then her mouth. And she laughed against him with the particular freedom of someone who has found the place where happiness is allowed. 2 children of our own, she said when they parted. 8 children altogether, he said. Is that too many? He looked at her with absolute certainty. There is not a number that would be too many, he said. Not for us. She hit his shoulder lightly, which was what she did when he said something that moved her, and she did not want to show it too completely. Running Elk came by that afternoon with the news that the horse partnership had received an inquiry from a buyer in Colorado who wanted 20 horses, which was the largest order they had received. Perry and Running Elk sat on the porch and worked through the logistics and the timing, and Violet came out with coffee and stayed for the conversation, contributing a practical point about the transport arrangement that Running Elk incorporated into the plan with the same nod of genuine acknowledgement. He always gave her observations. As he was leaving, Running Elk paused at the porch steps and looked at Perry with the particular quality of observation that was characteristic of him. "Your house is good," he said. "Full." "Very full," Perry agreed. Running Elk nodded. "Full houses make strong people," he said, and rode away. The second child, Perry and Violet's second together. The family's eighth was born in October of 1881. A boy named August after the month Thomas Finley had died, which was Violet's way of taking a month that had been full of grief and putting something living in it. August James Shelby, called Gus almost immediately by Clara, who made naming decisions swiftly and permanently, was a quieter baby than Thomas had been, with Perry's gray eyes and Violet's fine-boned quality about the face, and he arrived into a house that received him with the practiced and loving efficiency of a large family that knew what it was doing. Ruth, who was 11, took one look at the new baby and then at her mother and said, with the combined perception and practicality that were her defining qualities, "We are going to need to expand the east room." Violet, still tired from the birth but already smiling, said, "Yes, I think we might." Perry built the addition that following spring, not a separate room but an extension of the east bedroom, adding 8 feet that made it properly large enough for the growing population of small Shelbys. He built it the way he built everything, with care and precision and quality that would hold, using good lumber and proper joinery, and when he was done it fit the house as though it had always been there. Eli, who was 17 by the addition's completion and had the eye of someone who had been watching construction and repair for years, came and looked at the joinery at the corner and said, "Clean work." "Thank you," Perry said. "I want to learn to do that properly," Eli said. "Not just repairs, building." "I will teach you," Perry said. They shook hands on it as they always did when they made an agreement, the formal gesture that Perry had established with Eli from the beginning as a mark of respect, the acknowledgement that a deal between them was a deal between men who took their word seriously. The summer of 1882 was the summer Eli turned 18 and began to take on the operational management of the ranch with a capability that made Perry quietly and deeply proud. Not the pride of ownership, which was the wrong kind, but the pride of having watched someone become themselves and finding the result remarkable. Perry stepped back by degree, making himself available for consultation while letting Eli make the decisions, and the ranch did not suffer for it. It became more efficient, in fact, because Eli brought to it the combination of Perry's taught discipline and his own particular gifts, which included a quality with animals that Perry had always admired without being able to fully account for it. In the evenings, the family still gathered in the sitting room, though the configuration had changed with the years. Eli and Daniel were young men now, occupying their chairs with the different weight of older body presence, and Thomas at 2 was a solid and energetic presence underfoot, and Gus had begun to pull himself around the furniture with the purposeful determination that preceded walking. The older children took turns reading aloud, which had been Violet's tradition and had transferred naturally to the whole family, and Perry sat in his chair and listened to the voices of his family and felt the deep, settled satisfaction of something built to last and lasting. One evening in the autumn of 1882, when the children were settled and the house was finally quiet, Perry and Violet sat by the fire in the way they had sat every evening for 3 years now, and Violet had her knitting and Perry had his book, and the fire was low and good, and Violet said, without looking up from her needles, "Do you remember what you said to me the night I arrived?" "Come inside," he said, "all of you." She looked up at him. "Just that. It was the right thing to say." "You did not hesitate," she said. "A woman on a lame horse with 6 children in the cold, and you did not hesitate." "I have never been sorry about it," he said. She looked at him with the full weight of Violet Finley's attention, which was never casual and never small. "Neither have I," she said. "Not for one moment of one day." Perry set down his book. He was going to say something, had been composing it in some back part of his mind all evening, the way things do compose themselves when they are ready, about what 3 years of this life had given him, about the particular quality of loving someone whose strength matched your own, about the house and the 7 rooms, and the way a man could build something for reasons he could not name and be answered by the world in full. But Violet was already looking at him with her violet-brown eyes, and she already knew all of it, the way she knew most things about him, completely, and without having to be told. So instead he just said, "Come here." She set down her knitting and moved from her chair to his, fitting against him with the ease of long familiarity, and he put his arm around her, and she rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat by the fire, while the autumn wind moved against the windows, and the house held its warmth in all its rooms. The room where Eli slept and dreamed of the land he would one day fully steward, the room where Daniel drew by lamplight until he was too tired to hold the pencil. The room where Ruth was already asleep with the focused efficiency she brought to all things. The rooms where James and me and Clara slept in their various arrangements with the carved wooden horses on the windowsills. The room where Thomas and Gus breathed in the small, easy rhythm of children who feel safe, and the kitchen with Daniel's framed drawing hanging on the wall, a woman on a horse, and 6 small figures coming up the road toward a house with every window lit. Perry Shelby had built a house with 7 rooms and had not known why until she arrived with 6 children. He knew why now. He had always known, in the way that hands moving toward the right work know before the mind catches up, before the heart names what it is building toward. He had built it because the life he was meant to live required space, for a woman who was everything worth knowing, for children who were extraordinary each in their own particular way, for the noise and warmth and weight of a family gathered in from the cold, for all the rooms that love requires when you give it room enough to grow. Outside, the New Mexico stars came out one by one over the Sangre de Cristo range, ancient and clear and indifferent to the particular happiness of one family in one house on one bend of the Cimarron River. But the happiness was no less real for being small against the scale of the sky. It was, in fact, the only kind of happiness that is real, the kind built room by room, the kind come in from the cold and offered warmth, the kind that names itself in a child's voice calling up the stairs, in a woman's head on your shoulder, in 6 children's worth of future spread out before you in the good and certain dark. Perry held Violet close, and the fire burned low, and the house was full, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and all 7 rooms were exactly as they should be.